The dust rose in the heat of the Levant. The horizon blurred into a wavering haze. From within that haze appeared a figure in shining armor, each plate catching the sunlight as if cast by the heavens themselves. His banner of deep crimson with a silver cross cut through the sky, snapping in the dry wind. At his side hung a long sword glimmering with a cold, steady promise. Mounted on a great war horse, Richard of England rode at the head of thousands. Behind him came knights in chainmail, weary foot soldiers, clerics with relics, and pilgrims who carried both hope and fear in their eyes. The sound of drums and horns mixed with the chant of hymns, and in that moment, Richard was not merely a king, but the living vision of a knightly ideal, the embodiment of Christendom's power. And yet, across the centuries, one question endures. Why did a monarch who ruled for little more than 10 years leave behind a legend that outshone so many others? Why did Richard Plantagenet, third son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, become known as the Lionheart? His reign was short, his attention to England was limited, his treasury drained by ceaseless campaigns. Yet his figure looms larger than almost any ruler of his time. To understand why, one must return to the late 12th century, when Europe trembled with both faith and fear, and the clash between civilizations reached its height. This was the age when Christendom stood proud and yet endangered. The Holy Land, long the destination of pilgrims, had fallen to the forces of Saladin. In 1187, the Battle of Hattin shattered the Crusader states, and Jerusalem itself was lost. The news spread like fire across Europe. Churches filled with cries of grief, kings and nobles bowed their heads in shame, and the Pope called for another great crusade. It was to be no ordinary expedition, but a crusade led by kings themselves. Frederick Barbarossa, the Emperor of Germany, marched at the head of a colossal host. Philip Augustus of France pledged himself to the cause, and Richard of England prepared to take his place beside them. Europe, however, was far from united. The continent was a mosaic of ambition and rivalry. The French crown sought to grow at the expense of its rivals. The German emperor commanded vast armies but faced constant turmoil at home. The Plantagenet Empire, stretching from the Scottish border to the vineyards of Aquitaine, was a realm of power and fragility alike, ruled by a family whose brilliance was matched only by its endless feuds. It was within this world that Richard was shaped, and his destiny was forged not in the halls of Westminster, but in the courts of Aquitaine. Richard was born in 1157, the third son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. From his mother, he inherited a love of culture and chivalry, nurtured by poets and troubadours. From his father, he inherited strength, strategy, and the art of command, though father and son were more often in conflict than in harmony. Richard grew up more soldier than statesman, more knight than governor. By the time he came to the throne in 1189, after years of rebellion against his father and strife with his brothers, his heart and his ambition were already fixed on the East. His reign began at a moment when the church stood at the peak of spiritual authority, calling rulers to war in the name of God. At the same time, dynastic politics consumed Europe, with kingdoms rising and falling through alliances and betrayals. England itself was restless. Heavy taxes fell upon its people to fund their king's ventures abroad. Yet Richard seemed almost detached from the details of governance. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the land where honor could be won, not through laws or charters, but through sword and shield, where memory would be forged in the heat of battle. This is the paradox of Richard. He was a king who ruled little, but fought much. He was at once the model of medieval kingship and its greatest contradiction, a lion in courage, yet absent from his kingdom, a champion of Christendom, yet often at odds with fellow Christian rulers, a man of immense charisma whose image eclipsed his tangible achievements. His reign would not be remembered for reforms or councils, but for the sound of charging cavalry and the image of a king who seemed born for war. And so, we arrive at the threshold of his story. The drums beat, the hymns rise, the crimson banner with the silver cross flutters in the wind. Richard the Lionheart advances, not only as a sovereign, but as a figure of myth. His tale would be sung by minstrels, chronicled by monks, and carried through centuries as the legend of a Crusader king. In the closing years of the 12th century, when the dream of Jerusalem stirred kings and commoners alike, Richard rode forward into destiny, and the legend began. To answer that question, the making of the Lionheart, one must turn from the blinding heat of the Levant back to the hearth where he was forged. Before the banners and the battle hymns, there was a household of kings and quarrels, a dynasty whose brilliance was matched by its storms. In those halls, Richard learned what courage meant, what loyalty cost, and why power was never secure. Only then can the writer beneath the Crimson Cross be understood. As the son of Henry and Eleanor, heir to Aquitaine's songs and England's iron will, Richard's roots stretch deep into one of the most formidable dynasties of medieval Europe. He was born into the Plantagenet house, a family that embodied both brilliance and turmoil, unity and rebellion. His father, King Henry II of England, was a ruler of staggering energy, a man who restored order after years of civil war, known as the Anarchy. Henry built a judicial system, asserted royal authority across his far-flung dominions, and wielded his influence with unrelenting determination. Yet behind his genius lay a restlessness, a constant suspicion that often turned inward against his own blood. He was a man who conquered half of France, yet could not conquer the loyalty of his sons. His reign was a triumph of governance, but also a story of ceaseless family conflict. Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was no less formidable. She had been Queen of France as the wife of Louis XVI, before casting aside that marriage and aligning herself with Henry. Through her, Richard inherited Aquitaine, one of the richest and most cultured lands of Europe. Eleanor was unlike any other queen of her age. She was bold, politically astute, and unafraid to confront kings. In her court, poets and troubadours flourished, celebrating ideals of chivalry, courtly love, and knightly honor. It was from her that Richard drew the sense of romance that colored his vision of kingship. If Henry gave him the tools of strategy and ambition, Eleanor gave him the ideals of knighthood and the belief that kings could live as heroes in song as well as in law. The union of Henry and Eleanor was as volatile as it was powerful. Together, they commanded an empire that stretched from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees, a patchwork of lands greater than that of the French king. But their marriage was racked by suspicion, infidelity, and rebellion. The children born into this storm grew up in a world where loyalty was fragile and ambition a constant temptation. Richard, as the third son, might never have expected to inherit the crown of England. Yet the blood of both Henry and Eleanor burned fiercely in him, and from childhood he displayed a will that matched the greatest ambitions of his parents. Richard was born in September of 1157 at Oxford, but his true home was not England's grey castles or misted valleys. It was Aquitaine, the sunlit land of vineyards and troubadours, where stone towers overlooked winding rivers and fortified towns. In Aquitaine, Richard absorbed a culture steeped in poetry and song, where knights swore oaths to ladies and honor was pursued as fiercely as victory. Here he was taught the arts of command, the discipline of riding, and the wielding of arms. He was not raised to be a mere prince. He was raised to be a warrior lord, a defender of the rich lands his mother had passed to him. Even as a boy, Richard's character shone through. Chroniclers describe him as tall, strong, and commanding in presence. His voice carried with authority, and he quickly proved adept at inspiring loyalty in men. Yet he was not simply a stern commander. He had a passion for poetry, for music, for the courtly traditions of Aquitaine. He wrote verses, celebrated the ideals of chivalry, and saw himself not merely as a ruler of men, but as a knight of legend. To his followers, he embodied the perfect union of strength and culture, a warrior who could strike fear on the battlefield, yet recite lines of verse by firelight. From an early age, Richard was entrusted with real power. When he was still in his teens, his mother ensured he received the title of Duke of Aquitaine. With this came not only wealth, but responsibility. Richard soon found himself leading men in battle, quelling uprisings, and defending his lands. He learned the art of siege warfare, the complexities of command, and the harsh realities of politics. He was barely more than a boy, yet he carried the weight of a lord. His courage in these early years won him admiration, but his reliance on force also marked him as a man more comfortable in armor than in council chambers. The Plantagenet family, however, was not destined for peace. Henry II, though a masterful king, was a father whose relentless control smothered his sons. The young princes longed for independence, for lands of their own, for recognition, not as mere shadows of their father, but as rulers in their own right. It was this tension that tore the dynasty apart in a series of rebellions that scarred Richard's youth. In 1173, the great revolt of Henry's sons erupted. Richard, though still a youth, joined his brothers in defiance of their father. Alongside Henry the young king and Geoffrey of Brittany, Richard rose against Henry II, spurred on by Eleanor herself. The rebellion spread across the empire, drawing in allies from France and Scotland. It was not merely a quarrel of family. It was a civil war that threatened to unseat one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Richard fought fiercely, commanding forces in Aquitaine, showing already the qualities of a seasoned commander. Yet Henry II proved too strong, and the revolt collapsed. The aftermath was bitter. Eleanor was imprisoned by her husband, confined for years as punishment for her role in urging the rebellion. Richard and his brothers were forced to submit, their ambitions curbed, but not extinguished. For Richard, the rebellion cemented his image as a warrior rather than a politician. He had shown courage, but also the rashness of youth, preferring the clash of arms to the subtleties of diplomacy. The pattern repeated itself in the years that followed. Richard, entrusted with Aquitaine, faced constant unrest. The lords of the duchy resisted his authority, rising again and again in rebellion. Richard answered them with campaigns marked by both skill and severity. He stormed castles, suppressed uprisings, and forced his vassals into submission. Chroniclers note his relentless drive, his refusal to back down, and his willingness to lead from the front. He was not a ruler who delegated war. He was always in the thick of it, his banner at the head of the charge. To his supporters, he was the embodiment of knightly valor. To his enemies, he was a lord to be feared. Yet even in these years of strife, Richard never abandoned the culture of chivalry that shaped him. He composed poetry, celebrated the ideals of loyalty and honor, and lived as much in the world of song as in the world of arms. This duality, warrior and poet, commander and troubadour, set him apart from many rulers of his time. He was not merely fighting for power. He was fighting for a vision of himself, a role as the heroic knight who embodied the ideals sung in the halls of Aquitaine. But his relationship with his father remained fraught. Henry II could not bear to cede authority, and Richard could not accept perpetual subordination. Time and again, Richard joined with his brothers in plots and uprisings. The family was a stage of betrayal and reconciliation, of rebellion and submission. The Plantagenets were bound by blood, but torn by ambition, each son striving to carve out his place. In this storm, Richard's reputation grew. He became known as the most formidable of Henry's sons, the one whose courage and martial skill stood above the rest. Even his enemies admitted his prowess, and his legend began to take shape. The image of Richard in these years is not that of a calculating statesman, but of a knight in the grand tradition of Aquitaine. He was more comfortable leading a charge than sitting at council, more drawn to the clang of steel than the parchment of laws. He saw himself less as a bureaucrat and more as a figure of romance and war, a lord whose destiny was not to govern quietly, but to blaze across history with fire and song. This, perhaps, was his greatest strength and his greatest flaw. He won admiration, loyalty, and fear, but he did not yet learn the patience of a ruler. As the 12th century advanced, the stage was set for Richard's rise. His father's health declined, his brothers fell to death or intrigue, and Richard's place as heir became more certain. But before he would claim the throne, he would fight again, against enemies abroad and against his own kin. The storms of his youth forged him into the warrior who would one day ride east beneath the crimson banner with the silver cross. The roots of the Lionheart lay not only in the throne he would inherit, but in the fire of his family, the culture of Aquitaine, and the ceaseless rebellions that shaped his youth. Richard's story as a young man is one of contradiction. He was both the loyal son and the rebel prince, both the cultured poet and the relentless warrior. He embodied the spirit of his mother's Aquitaine and the iron will of his father's England. From this fusion came the man who would captivate Europe, a king who would be remembered less for his rule at home than for the legend he carried abroad. And as the world moved inexorably toward the great clash of the Third Crusade, Richard's identity as a warrior king was already sealed. He was not destined to be a quiet monarch. He was destined to be the Lionheart. Thus, while Richard was being forged in the fire of family strife and knightly culture, the world beyond his lands was also shifting. The memory of one failed crusade still haunted Christendom, and in the East, a new power was rising to challenge the very survival of the Crusader states. The destiny that would one day call Richard across the sea was already taking shape, written in the defeats of kings and the triumphs of Saladin. The memory of the Second Crusade still lingered over Europe, like a wound that refused to heal. 4 decades earlier, when the call to arms had first gone out, it had been led not by minor lords but by kings, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Their armies had marched with banners held high and hymns resounding, promising redemption for the loss of Edessa, one of the first Christian states in the East to fall. But the expedition dissolved in disaster. Mismanagement, poor strategy, and the resilience of their Muslim foes had turned the campaign into a humiliation. Armies were decimated, morale shattered, and the image of crusading kings tarnished. For many, it seemed as though God himself had abandoned their cause. The defeat burned deeply into the memory of Christendom. It was a scar upon the conscience of Europe, a reminder that faith and zeal alone could not guarantee victory. Out of that failure, the Islamic world grew stronger, united under a new figure whose name would echo across centuries, Saladin. Born into the turmoil of the Near East, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub rose first as a soldier and strategist in the service of his uncle, then as the leader who would forge Egypt and Syria into a single realm. He was no mere warlord. Chroniclers, both Muslim and Christian, recorded his qualities of generosity, discipline, and piety. He was a man whose strength in battle was matched by his reputation for mercy, whose vision extended beyond the conquest of towns to the unification of a people. By the 1180s, Saladin stood as the most formidable opponent the Crusader states had ever faced. The defining moment came in the summer of 1187. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem had grown complacent, its nobles divided by rivalries, its armies weakened by years of uneasy peace. Saladin seized his chance. At the Horns of Hattin near the Sea of Galilee, his forces met the army of Jerusalem. The Crusaders marched into the parched heat of July, burdened by thirst, hemmed in by Saladin's maneuvering, and broken by exhaustion. By the battle's end, the flower of Christian knighthood in the East lay defeated. The true cross, the holiest relic of Christendom, was captured. Jerusalem itself surrendered soon after, its gates opening to Saladin's disciplined army. The fall of the Holy City sent shockwaves across Europe. News of its loss raced through courts and cathedrals, borne by messengers who carried with them not only reports, but a sense of profound shame. Priests thundered from pulpits, kings fell silent in disbelief, and common folk wept at the thought that the city of Christ had been taken from their hands. The memory of the Second Crusade's failure was painful enough. The fall of Jerusalem was unbearable. For the faithful, it was as if the very heart of Christianity had been torn away. Pope Gregory VIII issued a new call to arms. His encyclical, Audita Tremendi, resounded through Christendom. It declared that calamity had fallen because of the sins of the faithful, and that redemption could only be found in a new crusade. Unlike previous ventures, this would not be a campaign of scattered lords or minor rulers. It would demand the leadership of kings themselves, monarchs whose authority could summon vast resources and whose crowns carried the weight of divine expectation. This was to be the Crusade of Kings, a gathering of Christendom's mightiest to reclaim what had been lost. Europe responded with fervor, from the Rhineland to the coast of England, from the plains of France to the hills of Lombardy. Sermons roused nobles and peasants alike. Crosses were sewn onto cloaks, vows sworn before altars, treasuries pledged for the holy cause. It was not merely a military endeavor, it was a spiritual wave that swept across the continent. Men and women believed they stood on the edge of destiny, that the fate of their souls was bound up with the fate of Jerusalem. Among the first to answer was the Emperor of Germany, Frederick Barbarossa. Now in his 70s, Frederick was a legend in his own right. His reign had seen him battle popes and princes, asserting imperial might over Italy and Germany alike. His name inspired both fear and admiration. When he took the cross, tens of thousands rallied to him. The German crusade would be the greatest army Europe had ever seen, a vast host of knights, infantry, and pilgrims marching overland toward the east. To many, it seemed as if the hand of God had already blessed the expedition. In France, King Philip II, known as Philip Augustus, also took the cross. Young but shrewd, Philip had already established himself as a formidable monarch. His reign was marked by careful consolidation of power, a steady hand in governance, and an eye for opportunity. Yet he was also wary, calculating, a ruler who measured gain against risk. For him, the crusade was not only a matter of faith, but of politics, a chance to enhance his prestige and secure alliances, even as he kept one eye fixed on the ambitions of his rivals. And in England, Richard, now king after the death of his father Henry II in 1189, declared his intent with characteristic boldness. For Richard, the crusade was not an obligation reluctantly accepted. It was the fulfillment of a destiny. From the moment he ascended the throne, he made clear that his reign would be defined not by charters or councils, but by the Holy War. He imposed taxes, sold offices, and even emptied royal coffers to fund the journey. To Richard, the cause of Jerusalem was not merely a matter of duty. It was the proving ground for his very identity as a king and a knight. Thus the stage was set. Three great monarchs, each representing the power of their realms, prepared to march for the Holy Land. Never before had such a convergence of kings occurred in the history of the Crusades. Frederick Barbarossa, the seasoned emperor whose age did nothing to diminish his authority. Philip Augustus, the calculating ruler of France, keen to secure his place on the European stage. And Richard the Lionheart, the young and fiery king whose very soul seemed forged for battle. For Christendom, it was a moment of hope, a chance to erase the shame of past defeats and to restore the glory of the cross. For the Muslim world, it was a moment of looming trial, as the greatest powers of the West prepared to descend upon the East. And for the kings themselves, it was the beginning of a journey that would test their strength, their faith, and their very legacies. Europe stood before the storm. The drums of war sounded once again, echoing from cathedral towers and castle walls. The Third Crusade was about to begin, and at its heart would be Richard, the king whose name would forever be bound to the destiny of Jerusalem. Thus, as Europe braced itself for the greatest crusade it had ever known, fate turned its gaze to England. The aging Henry II, long a master of law and intrigue, breathed his last, and with his passing, the crown passed to his son. In that moment, the call of Christendom and the destiny of a dynasty converged. Richard, already famed as a warrior and troubadour, now stood poised not only to inherit an empire, but to embody the hopes of a continent. The summer of 1189 brought the end of one reign and the beginning of another. Henry II, worn down by years of rebellion and illness, died at Chinon, leaving behind an empire fractured by strife, but still vast in scope. His third son, Richard, now stood as King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Lord of Aquitaine. The transition was more than political. It was the passing of a stormy, calculating age into one that promised fire, daring, and legend. Richard was 31, tall and commanding, a man already celebrated as both troubadour and warrior. Now he carried the weight of crowns, and Europe turned its eyes toward him. The coronation took place in Westminster amid the solemn grandeur of church ritual. The abbey filled with bishops, nobles, and envoys, each eager to witness the new king anointed with holy oil, vested in royal robes, and crowned with the circlet of England. Chroniclers describe the moment with reverence. Richard seated upon the throne, his face resolute, the orb and scepter in his hand symbolizing divine authority and temporal power. The chants of the clergy echoed against stone walls, and for a time it seemed as though the realm, despite all its quarrels, had united in the solemnity of the occasion. Yet, beyond the sacred rites, tension simmered in the streets of London. Anti-Jewish sentiment, long a dark undercurrent in European cities, erupted violently on the day of Richard's coronation. When Jewish envoys attempted to present gifts, as was customary, they were turned away from Westminster. Rumors spread that the king had ordered their exclusion, and mobs seized upon the moment. Riots broke out, with homes attacked and communities terrorized, though Richard himself did not sanction the violence. His name was invoked by those who sought justification. He responded with anger at the disorder, ordering punishments for rioters and protection for Jewish subjects, but the scars of that day would linger. It was a sobering reminder that even in the hour of his elevation, forces of intolerance and unrest could erupt beyond his control. From the very beginning, Richard made clear what his reign would be about. Unlike his father, whose genius lay in governance and law, Richard spoke openly of his single, overriding purpose, the Crusade. Jerusalem was his goal, the Holy Land his destiny. England, Normandy, Aquitaine. These were not prizes to be enjoyed, but resources to be harnessed for war in the East. His first acts as king were not to reform institutions or strengthen administration, but to gather the wealth and means necessary for departure. Offices were sold, lands pledged, even honors exchanged for coin. "I would sell London itself," he is said to have remarked, "if only I could find a buyer." It was a startling declaration, but it revealed his mind. To Richard, kingship was not measured in charters or courts, but in the field of battle. He saw himself not as a keeper of domestic peace, but as the champion of Christendom, bound by vow and honor to take up the cross. For the people of England, this meant heavy burdens, new taxes, levies, and demands that strained both commoners and lords. Yet there was also pride, for their king had committed himself to the greatest enterprise of the age. The coronation of 1189 thus set the tone for Richard's rule. It was at once a moment of glory and a glimpse of the turbulence to come. In the abbey, he was anointed as sovereign, the successor of a dynasty both revered and feared. In the streets, violence showed the fragility of order beneath the crown, and in his first proclamations, Richard revealed a vision that stretched beyond the Channel, beyond France, beyond the known horizons, toward Jerusalem, the city that had fallen, and the cause that now defined him. For those who watched him ride from Westminster that day, clad in regal garments and crowned with gold, it was clear they were witnessing not only the beginning of a reign, but the unfolding of a legend. Richard was no ordinary monarch. He was a man who would measure his kingship in crusades, a ruler who would leave his realm behind in pursuit of glory overseas. The Lionheart had ascended, and Europe prepared to follow him into history. Thus the crown, freshly set upon Richard's brow, became not a symbol of rest, but a summons to action. The solemn oil of Westminster had scarcely dried when his thoughts turned eastward, away from England's halls and toward Jerusalem's distant walls. To the new king, kingship itself was only the beginning. The true measure of his reign would be written not in parchment or courts, but in the dust of the Holy Land. No sooner had the crown settled upon Richard's brow than he turned his eyes toward the east. To him, the throne was not an end but a means, a platform from which to launch the greatest undertaking of his life. Jerusalem had fallen, and the weight of Christendom's shame pressed upon every monarch in Europe. Richard declared that his reign would be judged not by laws or charters, but by whether he could reclaim the holy city. To accomplish this, he needed gold, vast sums of it, and he resolved to extract every coin he could muster. The most infamous of his measures was the levy known as the saladin tithe. It was unlike any ordinary tax. Every subject of the realm, noble and commoner alike, was compelled to give a tenth of their income and possessions for the holy cause. Treasure was assessed, livestock counted, and hoards of silver weighed beneath the gaze of royal officers. For many, it was a crushing burden, but Richard was relentless. He made exceptions only for those who themselves took the cross, reasoning that to join the crusade was payment enough. The tithe filled the royal coffers at a speed never before seen, transforming the wealth of England into a river of coin flowing eastward. Yet even this was not enough for a king who intended to lead armies across seas and continents. Richard turned to every source of revenue available. He sold offices and titles with abandon, granting sheriffdoms, bishoprics, and lands to the highest bidder. Nobles jostled to secure positions, some paying dearly for honors that under other rulers might have been bestowed by grace alone. To Richard, such transactions were not corruption, but necessity. He famously remarked that he would sell the very city of London itself if a buyer could be found. Behind the jest lay a grim truth. For Richard, everything had its price if it brought him closer to Jerusalem. This fever of preparation spread through the kingdom. Castles were pledged, estates mortgaged, and debts written on parchment as nobles scrambled to fund their places in the king's host. Goldsmiths and moneylenders worked tirelessly, their tables piled with coin. Merchants thrived on the sudden surge of demand for ships, supplies, and arms. Yet for the common people the weight was heavy. Fields were taxed, homes stripped of savings, and the poor gave what little they had. To them, Richard's zeal was both inspiring and exhausting, a reminder that their king's heart belonged not to his own land, but to a cause beyond the sea. Still, there was grandeur in the enterprise. Chroniclers describe processions of knights swearing oaths, their mantles marked with crosses, their banners prepared for the march. Smiths hammered out armor day and night, their sparks illuminating village streets. Monks chanted prayers for victory, while the people whispered tales of their king, whose spirit seemed already half gone to the east. Richard's determination infected the realm. Though he was stripping England of wealth, he also filled it with the sense that they were part of something vast and sacred, that their sacrifices were bound up with the destiny of Christendom itself. In this way, the kingdom transformed into a great engine of crusade. Every coin, every office, every title became fuel for the fire Richard carried in his heart. His vision was clear. The Lionheart would march eastward not as a petitioner, but as a conqueror, leading a host worthy of his ambition. England itself became a treasury for Jerusalem, and its king, restless and unyielding, prepared to depart for the horizon where faith and glory awaited. Thus England itself became a treasury for Jerusalem, its fields and coffers drained into the king's great design. And when the last coin was counted, the last cross sewn upon a mantle, Richard carried his kingdom's sacrifice to the sea. From the keys of Western Europe, the vision born in taxes and oaths now unfurled in sails and banners, as the Lionheart's fleet prepared to bear Christendom's hopes toward the horizon. The ports of Western Europe soon filled with the clamor of preparation. Ships were fitted, sails patched, barrels of grain and wine stacked high. Richard's fleet was said to be the largest ever assembled by an English king. Sleek galleys and broad transports, each painted with bright insignia, their prows pointing toward the horizon. To the onlookers crowding the quays, it seemed as though an entire nation was setting out across the sea. Yet beneath the banners and hymns, tensions brewed. Richard was not alone in his enterprise. King Philip Augustus of France had also pledged himself to the crusade, and where two powerful monarchs marched together, suspicion followed as surely as the tide. The rivalry between Richard and Philip was born of old wounds. They had once been allies against Richard's father, Henry II, but friendship had long since soured. Philip was calculating, cautious, and resentful of the flamboyant English king who seemed to seize both glory and attention with ease. Richard, for his part, mistrusted Philip's motives and feared that the French king might use the crusade as cover to expand his influence at home. Their alliance was one of necessity rather than trust, and as their fleets prepared to sail, Europe whispered of quarrels yet to come. The kings agreed to set out separately, meeting again in the Mediterranean. Philip departed first, his ships bound directly for the east. Richard lingered, his fleet delayed by storms and the sheer magnitude of his preparations. When he finally launched, the journey was anything but smooth. Tempests scattered his vessels, some cast ashore on foreign coasts, others limping into distant harbors. Yet the king pressed on, and his first great stop was the island of Sicily. There, in the bustling city of Messina, Richard encountered both welcome and turmoil. The Sicilian throne had recently passed to King Tancred, a ruler whose legitimacy was contested. The widow of the previous king, Joanna, Richard's own sister, had been left in Sicily under strained circumstances, and Richard demanded her release along with her dowry. Tancred hesitated, unwilling to weaken his fragile hold on power, and tension flared. Richard, never patient in negotiation, allowed his soldiers to seize parts of Messina, raising the English standard over its walls. The display of force sent a clear message. Wherever Richard traveled, his will was to be respected. Eventually, Tancred yielded, releasing Joanna and granting concessions. The two kings reconciled with a show of ceremony, exchanging gifts and vows of friendship. Yet the episode revealed once more the fiery impatience of the Lionheart, and it deepened the unease Philip Augustus already felt at his companion in arms. From Sicily, Richard's fleet sailed eastward once more, only to face further trial. Storms struck in the eastern Mediterranean, scattering ships upon rocky shores. Some were wrecked on the island of Cyprus, where survivors were seized by Isaac Komnenos, a Byzantine noble who had set himself up as ruler of the island. When Richard himself arrived, he found his men imprisoned, their goods confiscated. The insult was intolerable. With the swiftness that marked all his campaigns, Richard launched an assault. The conquest of Cyprus unfolded with startling speed. Richard's forces stormed coastal towns, defeating Isaac's troops in battle and driving him into retreat. Within weeks, the island submitted. Chroniclers record the astonishment of contemporaries, who marveled that a king en route to Jerusalem could pause long enough to seize an entire realm. Yet Richard understood the strategic value of Cyprus. The island offered safe harbors, fertile supplies, and a crucial base for operations in the Levant. By its conquest, he ensured that the Crusaders would have a secure staging ground, and in the process, he added yet another jewel to the crown of his legend. It was on Cyprus, too, that Richard's personal life took a dramatic turn. Berengaria of Navarre, daughter of King Sancho VI, had been brought to join him as his bride. The match had been carefully arranged for political advantage, strengthening Richard's ties to the Iberian kingdoms and countering French influence. In a ceremony both solemn and splendid, Richard and Berengaria were wed on the island he had just conquered. The union was celebrated with pomp, though it was not destined to be a marriage of warmth or enduring closeness. Richard's heart remained fixed on his crusading vow, and Berengaria would see little of her husband in the years ahead. Still, the spectacle of a king marrying on the march to war added yet another layer of romance to the unfolding story. By the time Richard's fleet sailed from Cyprus, his reputation had grown still greater. He was no longer merely a monarch setting out on crusade. He was a conqueror, a liberator of his sister, a husband, and the master of a strategic island. Yet his rivalry with Philip Augustus deepened. The French king looked with suspicion on Richard's every move, convinced that the English king sought not only Jerusalem, but glory at France's expense. Their alliance, fragile at best, would soon be tested in the very heart of the Holy Land. Thus the Lionheart advanced toward Acre, the city where the armies of Christendom had gathered, and where the fate of the Third Crusade would first be decided. Behind him lay the storms of the sea, the quarrels of kings, and the conquest of Cyprus. Before him loomed the long struggle against Saladin, a contest that would pit two titans of their age against one another. The voyage had forged Richard's legend, but the true test of his kingship still awaited on the shores of the Levant. Thus the Lionheart advanced toward Acre, carrying with him the weight of storms weathered, kingdoms challenged, and alliances tested. The seas and islands had hardened his resolve, but it was on the battered walls of the Holy Land that his true trial would begin. By the time Richard arrived on the shores of the Holy Land in 1191, the great city of Acre had already endured nearly 2 years of siege. What had begun as a desperate effort by the remnants of the Crusader states had grown into a massive encampment of Europe's armies, stretching along the coast in a sprawl of tents, fortifications, and siege engines. The air was thick with heat, disease, and the smoke of ceaseless assaults. Saladin's forces surrounded the Crusader lines from the hills, pressing in from without, while the garrison of Acre resisted fiercely from within. Between the two, the crusading host was caught in a grim stalemate. Into this weary struggle rode Richard, his banners snapping in the coastal wind. His arrival was electrifying. Chroniclers describe the sudden surge of morale as the English king stepped ashore, clad in armor commanding with both voice and presence. His fleet brought supplies, fresh troops, and heavy siege equipment, all of which transformed the balance at Acre. Richard came not as another participant in the siege, but as the figure destined to decide it. Alongside him stood Philip Augustus, who had already been in the east for some months. The two kings united their forces, and for a brief moment it seemed that Christendom might achieve harmony under their joint command. But beneath the surface, rivalry simmered. Philip resented Richard's charisma, the way soldiers flocked to his banner, and the ease with which the Lionheart seized the admiration of chroniclers and clergy alike. Richard, for his part, mistrusted Philip's caution and believed his companion more concerned with political advantage than with holy zeal. Still, for the sake of Jerusalem, they fought together. The siege of Acre reached a fever pitch. Massive wooden towers creaked forward, their heights bristling with archers. Stone-throwing engines hurled great boulders against the walls, shaking towers and ramparts with each strike. The garrison resisted with determination, launching counterattacks, burning siege works, and hurling missiles of their own. Saladin's forces harassed the Crusader lines, sending flights of arrows into the camps and attempting to break the encirclement. The struggle became one of endurance, with both sides fighting not only each other, but also hunger, heat, and the weight of time. Richard himself was said to have taken part with tireless energy. Though stricken by illness during the campaign, he directed assaults from a litter, his command unwavering. He supervised the construction of massive engines, encouraged his men with words and rewards, and displayed the same indomitable will that had carried him through countless battles. His presence alone seemed to stiffen resolve, and the Crusaders, once flagging, found new determination under his leadership. In July 1191, the defenses of Acre could endure no longer. Starvation and relentless bombardment had brought the garrison to collapse. With no relief in sight, the defenders offered surrender, the gates opened, and the Crusaders at last marched into the city that had become the focal point of their struggle. Trumpets blared, banners rose, and the cross once again flew above Acre's walls. For Christendom, it was a moment of triumph. A victory that promised the path to Jerusalem lay open once more. Yet the fall of Acre did not bring unity. Instead, it deepened divisions between Richard and Philip. Both kings claimed rights to the spoils, the ransoms of prisoners, and the control of the city. Richard, flush with victory, distributed rewards to his men with a generosity that won their loyalty, while Philip maneuvered to secure influence and recognition. The rivalry, long simmering, now erupted in open quarrels. Chroniclers recorded disputes over banners, precedence, and the division of treasure. Acre had fallen, but the Crusader camp was already fracturing. Philip, weary of illness and wary of Richard's growing dominance, soon decided to withdraw. He announced his intention to return to France, leaving behind a token force but abandoning the Crusades' leadership. His departure placed the burden squarely on Richard's shoulders. For the Crusaders, it was both a loss and a liberation, a loss of French strength, but a liberation from the constant disputes that had sapped their unity. Richard was now the undisputed commander of the crusade. The capture of Acre marked a turning point in the Third Crusade. For the first time since the disaster of Hattin, Christendom had seized a major victory. Yet even in triumph, the contradictions of the crusade were laid bare. Victory was purchased at staggering cost, unity dissolved into rivalry, and the dream of Jerusalem still lay far ahead. For Richard, the fall of Acre was both vindication and burden. He had proven himself the Lionheart, the king who could achieve what others could not. But now the eyes of the world turned to him alone, demanding that he carry the cross forward into battles yet more desperate and decisions yet more costly. The walls of Acre, battered and broken, stood as both symbol and prophecy. They bore witness to the might of Richard's will, and they foreshadowed the trials that awaited him. For though the city had fallen, the war had only begun. Ahead lay Arsuf, Jaffa, and the shadow of Jerusalem itself, destinies bound inseparably to the name of Richard the Lionheart. The fall of Acre was a triumph, but it was also a beginning. For though the city had yielded, Saladin himself had not. Beyond the broken walls, the Sultan still commanded the loyalty of armies and the reverence of his people. Richard's banner now flew above Acre. Yet both he and the world knew that the true contest lay ahead, not in the taking of a city, but in the clash between two leaders whose names would come to define the age. The fall of Acre reverberated across the Levant. For the Crusaders, it was proof that the tide could be turned. For Saladin, it was a bitter loss, but not a final defeat. The Sultan still commanded a vast army seasoned by years of campaigning, bound by devotion and loyalty to his cause. And in Richard, he now faced an adversary unlike any he had encountered before. A warrior king whose reputation was already legend, whose presence on the battlefield seemed to infuse his army with strength. The clash of these two towering figures would define the Third Crusade, not in a single duel, but in a contest of endurance, strategy, and will. The two men never crossed swords in personal combat, though chroniclers would later imagine such scenes with relish. Instead, they confronted each other through armies, maneuvers, and negotiations. Yet in every account, there is a thread of mutual recognition. Each understood that in the other, he faced not merely a rival, but an equal, a figure shaped by destiny. Richard admired Saladin's discipline, his capacity to command loyalty, and his code of honor. Saladin respected Richard's courage, his relentless energy, and his refusal to yield even when outnumbered. It was as though two forces of nature had found themselves locked in balance, each testing the limits of the other. After Acre, Richard marched south along the coast toward Jaffa, determined to secure the road to Jerusalem. Saladin shadowed him, sending swift cavalry to harass the column, probing for weakness, seeking to break the rhythm of the march. The Crusader army moved in strict formation, knights riding on the flanks, infantry and crossbowmen in the center, their banners held high above the shimmering heat of the coastal plain. Richard rode among them, issuing orders, calming panic when sudden attacks swept down, and ensuring that the discipline of the column did not falter. The confrontation reached its height at Arsuf in September 1191. Saladin had chosen the ground carefully, hoping to wear down the Crusaders with repeated charges of cavalry. Wave after wave of mounted warriors thundered against the Crusader ranks, arrows raining down, drums and horns resounding across the field. The pressure was immense, but Richard held his men steady, forbidding them to break formation until the moment was right. Chroniclers describe the tension rising with every attack, the knights straining against their reins, eager to charge, until at last Richard gave the signal. The Crusader cavalry surged forward in a sudden explosive counterattack. With lances leveled, they crashed into Saladin's forces, breaking through the lines and scattering horsemen who had pressed too close. Richard himself rode at the forefront, his armor gleaming, his banner flying above the tumult. The countercharge was decisive. Though Saladin's army withdrew in good order, the field belonged to the Crusaders. Arsuf was no annihilation, but it was a victory, one that restored the prestige of Christian arms and proved that Richard could not only withstand Saladin's pressure but also strike back with devastating force. The battle cemented Richard's reputation among his followers. To them, he was not merely a king, but a commander who shared their dangers, a leader whose courage seemed inexhaustible. Song soon spread of the Lionheart's valor, of the day when he turned back the might of Saladin on the plain of Arsuf. Yet even in victory, Richard recognized the measure of his adversary. Saladin's army was not broken. The Sultan withdrew with order, regrouped swiftly, and remained a constant shadow on the march. Richard knew that every gain would be contested, that each step toward Jerusalem would demand not just strength, but also patience. Between battles, the two leaders sometimes exchanged envoys, gifts, and words of respect. Richard sent doctors to treat Saladin's relatives. Saladin, in turn, sent fruit and snow to cool the fever of his foe. These gestures, small yet profound, captured the paradox of their struggle. A war fought with ferocity, yet tempered by recognition of the humanity of the opponent. Chroniclers marveled at this chivalry, painting a picture of two great men who, though they fought without mercy in the field, honored one another as worthy adversaries. The march south continued, marked by skirmishes, sieges, and maneuvers. Each encounter added to the legend of the Lionheart and the Sultan. Neither could deliver a final blow, yet neither could be ignored. Richard's victories at Acre and Arsuf secured the coast for the Crusaders, giving them bases from which to threaten Jerusalem. Saladin's resilience ensured that the holy city remained beyond reach, guarded not only by walls but by the resolve of a leader determined never to surrender it. In the eyes of Europe, the struggle became almost mythic. The Lionheart and the Sultan, two warriors of equal stature, circling each other across the landscapes of the Holy Land. To later generations, their rivalry would stand as the very symbol of the crusading age, not merely a clash of faiths, but a duel of characters, of ideals, of two visions of kingship. They never touched blades, but their battle was no less personal, and their respect for one another only deepened the legend. Thus, the Third Crusade entered its most dramatic phase. With Arsuf behind him, Richard had shown that Christendom could win in the field, that the shadow of Hattin could be dispelled, but the road ahead was long, and Jerusalem still loomed untaken on the horizon. Between Richard and Saladin stretched a contest that would test not just armies, but the endurance of two men whose names would echo long after the banners of their age had faded. The truce steadied the frontiers of the Holy Land, but it did not steady Richard's world. Victory in the field gave way to uncertainties of courts and crowns. As the banners were furled along the coast, a different struggle gathered across the channel. One of rival kings, restless barons, and a brother too ready to seize advantage. Leaving behind the dust of Palestine, Richard set his course for Europe, where fortune would be measured not by charges and counters, but by deception, captivity, and the price a kingdom could pay. The victory at Arsuf gave Richard and the Crusaders a renewed sense of hope. For the first time since the disaster at Hattin, Christian forces had not only survived an open battle with Saladin's army, but had emerged triumphant. The coastal road was secured, and the march to Jaffa unfolded with fewer interruptions. When the Crusaders entered the port city, they restored its walls and defenses, creating a stronghold from which to strike deeper into the Holy Land. The dream of Jerusalem once again came into view, yet the path to the Holy City was fraught with dilemmas. Richard's army was formidable, but it was also stretched thin. Disease lingered in the camps, supply lines grew longer and more precarious, and tensions simmered between the diverse contingents of Europe's host. Italians, Germans, French, and English all brought their own rivalries and jealousies. Without Philip Augustus, who had returned to France, Richard bore the burden of leadership alone. Every decision weighed heavily, for each choice carried both military and spiritual consequences. The question of Jerusalem hung over every council of war. To march inland would be to risk supply shortages and constant harassment by Saladin's horsemen. The memory of Hattin haunted the Crusaders, the fear of being cut off from water, of being lured into the barren hills. Yet to remain on the coast was to appear hesitant, perhaps even faithless. Pilgrims and knights alike had crossed oceans for the chance to see the Holy City, and they pressed Richard to act. The Lionheart wrestled with the dilemma whether to gamble all on a direct assault or to consolidate along the coast and strike strategically at Saladin's resources. Saladin, for his part, proved as unyielding as ever. Though shaken by Arsuf, he rallied his forces, reinforcing Jerusalem's defenses and fortifying his hold on the surrounding countryside. He adopted a strategy of patience, avoiding decisive battle, knowing that time and hardship might accomplish what swords could not. His presence loomed like a shadow over the Crusaders, never far away, always ready to strike at weakness. The Crusaders advanced inland in the autumn of 1191, drawing ever closer to Jerusalem. Chroniclers speak of the awe that swept through the ranks when, from distant ridges, the knights glimpsed the holy city shining in the haze. The sight stirred hearts to fervor. Men wept, sang hymns, and dropped to their knees in prayer. For a moment, it seemed as though destiny was within reach. Yet Richard hesitated. Scouts brought word of Saladin's forces gathering nearby, of wells poisoned and supplies scarce. To attack Jerusalem without secure logistics risked repeating the catastrophe of Hattin. At council, the debates were fierce. Many urged an immediate assault, trusting in divine providence to deliver victory. Richard argued for caution, insisting that Jerusalem could not be held without proper fortifications and supply lines. To capture the city and lose it again, he declared, would be a greater disgrace than not to take it at all. His reasoning was sound, but it disappointed many who longed for the glory of reclaiming the Holy Sepulchre. Through the winter, the Crusaders remained in stalemate. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud. Disease crept through the camps and morale wavered. Still, Richard worked tirelessly. He strengthened fortresses along the coast, secured supply routes, and sought to maintain discipline. He also began to explore the path of diplomacy. Envoys passed between his tent and Saladin's court, carrying proposals for truces, prisoner exchanges, and even bold suggestions of a marriage alliance that might unite Christian and Muslim dynasties. None came to fruition, but the very fact that such talks occurred reveals the mutual respect between the two leaders and their recognition of the limits of war. By the spring of 1192, the Crusaders again prepared to march on Jerusalem. Once more they advanced, once more the Holy City drew near, and once more the army felt the thrill of approaching its goal. Yet again, hesitation struck. Reports told of Saladin's forces massing in strength, of the countryside stripped bare, of the risks of entrapment. The council of leaders debated furiously, but consensus was elusive. Richard's voice carried the day. The march was abandoned. The disappointment was profound. Soldiers wept openly, pilgrims cried out in anger, and rumors spread of betrayal. For many, to turn back when Jerusalem was so near felt like failure. Yet Richard understood the larger game. He shifted focus to the coast, retaking and fortifying Jaffa, a critical port that secured Crusader presence in the region. Saladin struck back, launching a sudden assault on the city. For a moment, it seemed as though Jaffa might fall, but Richard's swift return and bold counterattack saved it. Chroniclers describe him wading into the fray with unshakable courage, rallying his men until the enemy withdrew. The defense of Jaffa became one of the defining moments of his campaign, a testament to his relentless energy and refusal to yield even when pressed to the edge. The duel between Richard and Saladin thus settled into a rhythm of thrust and counterthrust, neither able to deliver the final blow. Both men, exhausted by years of war, recognized the need for resolution. In the late summer of 1192, negotiations resumed in earnest. The result was a truce. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed free access to the holy sites. The coastal cities would remain in Crusader hands, providing a foothold for Christendom in the Levant. It was not the triumphant victory many had dreamed of, but it was a settlement that reflected the balance of power. Richard accepted the terms with mixed feelings. He had not achieved the crowning glory of his crusade, yet he had preserved the Crusader states and secured safe passage for countless pilgrims. More than that, he had proven himself as one of the greatest military leaders of his age, a king whose courage and resolve had matched the might of Saladin. Their struggle ended not with a final clash, but with a recognition of mutual endurance, of two titans who had tested each other to the utmost. For Richard, the truce marked the end of his eastern adventure. He prepared to return to Europe, where new challenges awaited, including the intrigues of Philip Augustus and the ambitions of his own brother John. But the memory of his time in the Holy Land would endure. To his followers, he was the Lionheart, the king who had faced Saladin and emerged unbroken. To Saladin's people, he was the mightiest of the Franks, a foe worthy of respect. Between them, they had written a chapter of history that would echo long after both men were gone. Thus, the long struggle for Jerusalem ended in compromise rather than conquest. The holy city remained beyond Richard's grasp, yet his name was forever bound to it. He had marched within sight of its walls, battled tirelessly against the greatest leader of the Muslim world, and left behind a legacy of valor and determination. The Lionheart had not taken Jerusalem, but he had carved a place for himself in legend, alongside the city that drew his heart yet eluded his crown. The truce with Saladin closed the chapter of Richard's eastern adventure, but it did not bring him peace. If the Holy Land had tested his courage, Europe would test his fortune. As he turned his face homeward, he left behind the deserts and citadels of the Crusade, only to enter a world where betrayal, captivity, and renewed war awaited him. The struggle for Jerusalem had ended, but the struggle for the Plantagenet Empire was only beginning. When the truce with Saladin was sealed in 1192, Richard knew his time in the East had come to an end. The Lionheart had fought for 3 relentless years, carving victories out of despair, shaping a legend on the plains of Arsuf and in the walls of Acre. Yet Jerusalem remained beyond his grasp. The holy city lay just out of reach, its towers glimmering on the horizon, but never within his crown's embrace. Now, weary and restless, Richard turned his face homeward. The voyage ahead, however, would test him in ways no battlefield ever had. The journey back to England was fraught with peril. Richard had made enemies not only in the east, but in Europe itself. Philip Augustus, resentful of his rival's glory and eager to seize advantage, had already returned to France, plotting against English holdings across the Channel. John, Richard's own brother, stirred unrest at home, whispering treachery in England's castles and courts. And in the heart of the empire, Duke Leopold of Austria nursed a bitter grudge. Richard had insulted him during the siege of Acre, tearing down his banner from the city's walls and casting it aside, a humiliation Leopold would not forget. Knowing his enemies waited, Richard attempted to return quietly, moving in disguise through Central Europe. He traveled not as a king, but as a simple knight, wrapped in humble clothing, seeking to pass unnoticed through foreign lands. Yet fate betrayed him. In December 1192, near Vienna, he was recognized by Leopold's men. Stories say it was a ring, or perhaps his commanding presence, that gave him away. Whatever the cause, the Lionheart fell into the hands of a prince he had once scorned. The capture of Richard stunned Christendom. To seize a king, and one who had carried the cross, was an act that shocked the conscience of Europe. Yet Leopold saw only the chance for revenge and profit. He handed Richard over to the Emperor Henry VI of Germany, who demanded a ransom the likes of which no kingdom had ever paid. The sum was staggering. 150,000 marks of silver, equal to 2 or 3 times the entire annual revenue of England. To many, it seemed impossible. But the emperor knew the Plantagenets had wealth, and he trusted that Eleanor of Aquitaine, the indomitable mother of kings, would find a way. Richard's imprisonment was both physical and symbolic. He was confined in cold stone castles along the Danube and Rhine, guarded by German knights, his freedom a bargaining chip in imperial politics. Yet even in chains, his legend grew. Tales spread of the Lionheart playing his lute in captivity, of loyal minstrels wandering through Europe seeking their king, of Richard's spirit unbroken despite his confinement. Though embellished by time, these stories reflected a truth. Richard's charisma could not be contained by walls. Back in England, the demand for ransom fell like a thunderclap. The kingdom had already been drained by the cost of the crusade, yet now it was asked to deliver the greatest sum ever raised. And it was Eleanor, now in her 70s, who rose to the challenge. The Queen Mother became once more the beating heart of the dynasty. She traveled tirelessly across England and Normandy, rallying barons, bishops, and towns to contribute. Churches stripped their treasuries, nobles sold lands, and peasants offered what little they could. The burden was immense, but it carried the urgency of loyalty. For all his absence, Richard remained their king, and to ransom him was to redeem their honor. John, however, saw opportunity in his brother's captivity. He schemed with Philip Augustus, offering allegiance in return for French support. Together, they hoped to carve England and its continental possessions for themselves. Castles declared for John, and whispers of usurpation spread. But Eleanor, with her indomitable will, outmaneuvered them. She secured loyalty where it mattered, crushed rebellions, and kept alive the cause of her absent son. It was her energy, not Richard's, that preserved the realm during those years of uncertainty. Meanwhile, Henry VI played his game of power. To hold Richard was to hold leverage over all of Europe. He paraded the captive king before courts, demanding obedience, basking in the authority that came from possessing the Lionheart. Yet Richard never bowed. Chroniclers describe him standing tall even in captivity, his bearing so regal that his captors seemed diminished beside him. To many, he appeared as Job or Daniel, tested by God in exile, yet destined for deliverance. The ransom was gathered slowly, painfully. Taxation, levies, and loans piled up, filling the treasuries coin by coin. Eleanor herself crossed into Germany to negotiate for her son's release, confronting emperors and dukes with the same courage that had once led her across the Second Crusade. At last, in 1194, the price was paid. Wagons of silver crossed the Rhine, and the chains upon Richard were loosed. The Lionheart was free once more, his captivity having lasted over a year. His return to England was greeted with both relief and ceremony. In March 1194, Richard was crowned again at Winchester, reaffirming his kingship as if to erase the humiliation of captivity. Chroniclers describe him striding through the hall, his presence undiminished, his authority unquestioned. Those who had doubted him, those who had wavered in loyalty, now bent the knee. John, ever the schemer, begged forgiveness, which Richard granted with a mixture of pragmatism and contempt. For though the Lionheart was mercurial, he valued strength over bitterness, and John's treachery was overlooked for the moment. Yet Richard's heart was not in England. The land of his birth had never been the land of his soul. He spent only weeks consolidating power before turning his gaze once more to France, where Philip Augustus had seized castles and lands during his absence. To Richard, this was unfinished business. The true arena of his kingship lay across the Channel in the endless struggle for the Angevin Empire. He crossed into Normandy with fire in his eyes, rallying knights and barons determined to undo what Philip had gained. For the next 5 years, Richard poured his energy into war with France, leading campaigns of brilliance and daring, winning sieges, forcing truces, and outmaneuvering his rival at every turn. It was as though the years of captivity had only sharpened his resolve. In diplomacy, in battle, in reputation, he reasserted himself as one of Europe's greatest monarchs. But England, though loyal, remained neglected. Richard drained its coffers for war, demanded taxes for campaigns few of his subjects ever saw, and spent scarcely more than 6 months in the land he ruled. His absence was both a curse and a paradox. He was adored as a hero, celebrated in song and legend, yet distant as a ruler, a king who belonged more to the battlefields of France and the memory of the Crusade than to the daily lives of his people. Thus Richard returned from the East, not to peace but to another war, not to reflection but to struggle. His capture and ransom had revealed both his vulnerability and his greatness. He was a king who had been chained, yet who never ceased to command respect. He was a son saved by the devotion of his mother, a brother betrayed yet restored, a ruler who seemed destined always to live in the storm. The story of his return was not one of triumphal homecoming, but of tragedy tinged with resilience. The Lionheart came back to England crowned once more, only to leave it again, drawn ever onward by the call of war. His life had become a tapestry of conquest, captivity, and ceaseless struggle, and though he was king, he lived less as a sovereign of peace than as a warrior forever seeking the next field of glory. For Eleanor, the ordeal had proved her strength one final time. She had ransomed her son, preserved his crown, and stood as the guardian of the dynasty. For England, it had been a time of sacrifice and burden, of silver wrung from every corner to free the man who was their monarch, yet scarcely their ruler. And for Richard, it was a chapter that deepened his legend. He had faced Saladin, endured chains, and returned to reclaim his throne. Few men in history would know such heights and such depths, bound together in the life of a single king. The Lionheart's return was not the end of his tale, but it was its most haunting twist. He had marched to Jerusalem and turned back. He had fallen into captivity and risen again. He had worn a crown, only to leave it behind for war. Richard remained to the last a king of crusades and campaigns, a ruler forged in the furnace of conflict. His homecoming was marked not by rest, but by a renewal of strife, the story of a monarch who belonged not to the peace of his kingdom, but to the ceaseless call of battle. By the close of 1198, Richard stood once more at the height of his power. Normandy held firm behind the walls of Chateau Gaillard. His armies had checked Philip's advance, and his name inspired fear and admiration across Europe. Yet beneath the triumph, cracks were beginning to show. Years of war had drained his coffers, wearied his people, and left his kingdom stretched thin. The great contest with Philip was easing into uneasy truces, but smaller disputes now flared among barons and viscounts, quarrels that seemed trivial beside crusades and empires. And it was in one such quarrel, far from the thunder of kings and crowns, that fate would strike. As winter gave way to spring in 1199, Richard turned south into the Limousin toward Chalus, and the end of his story. When Richard emerged from captivity in 1194, he returned to a world transformed. During his long absence, Philip Augustus had wasted no time in exploiting the chaos. While Richard languished in the castles of Germany, the French king pressed forward, claiming lands, castles, and loyalties once bound to the Plantagenet crown. Normandy, the jewel of Richard's continental holdings, was under pressure. Anjou and Aquitaine were restless. Philip's ambition was clear: to dismantle the Angevin Empire piece by piece, to crush the might of the Plantagenets until only the Kingdom of England remained. Philip Augustus had once marched beside Richard beneath the banner of the cross, but whatever brotherhood the crusade had forged had long since evaporated. Their alliance, born of necessity, had ended in rivalry, jealousy, and open hostility. Now Philip stood as Richard's greatest enemy, not across the sands of the Holy Land, but across the green fields and stone fortresses of France. The Lionheart wasted no time. Barely had he set foot on English soil before he crossed the Channel to Normandy. England had ransomed him, but it was in France that his destiny lay. His return was nothing short of explosive. Castles that had fallen to Philip's grasp were retaken in swift campaigns. Barons who had sworn allegiance to France were forced back into obedience, and the balance of power shifted once again. Richard's energy was relentless. It was as though the chains of Germany had only hardened his resolve. The war between the two kings was a contest not just of armies, but of wills. Philip wielded diplomacy as skillfully as he wielded swords, enticing vassals with promises, undermining Richard's allies, and striking swiftly when advantage beckoned. Richard countered with force, charisma, and a brilliance for strategy. He moved with the precision of a knight on the tournament field, anticipating Philip's every feint, answering deceit with daring. The campaigns of the mid-1190s became a deadly dance, with Normandy as the prize. Among Richard's greatest achievements in this struggle was the conception and construction of Chateau Gaillard. Rising above the cliffs of the Seine, the fortress was unlike anything Europe had seen before. Built with astonishing speed between 1196 and 1198, it was Richard's answer to Philip's aggression, a citadel of white stone gleaming against the green valley below. A symbol as much as a stronghold. "Behold," Richard is said to have declared, "my child, my fair one." To him, the fortress was not merely stone and mortar, but the embodiment of his will, his answer to those who sought to break him. Chroniclers marveled at its design. High walls crowned the cliffs, towers jutted like lances, and ingenious defenses guarded every approach. It was a castle ahead of its time, built with the artistry of a warrior who understood that fortresses were more than walls, they were statements of intent. Chateau Gaillard declared to the world that Normandy would not fall, that the Lionheart's spirit was carved into the very rock of the land. The campaigns that followed saw Richard at the height of his powers. He struck quickly, retaking towns, outmaneuvering Philip, forcing truces on terms that favored the Plantagenets. Time and again, the French king found himself checked by Richard's energy. Where Philip sought to encircle, Richard broke through. Where Philip sought to delay, Richard forced decision. The chronicles of the age are filled with tales of Richard's daring, riding tirelessly from fortress to fortress, appearing suddenly where least expected, always pressing, always relentless. The image of the two kings could not have been more different. Philip, deliberate and calculating, cloaked his ambition in caution. Richard, fiery and bold, embodied the very image of knightly kingship. Together they represented two models of power, one grounded in patience, the other in audacity. Their struggle was as much about the future of monarchy as it was about the lands of Normandy. And yet, for all Richard's brilliance, the war was costly. Normandy bled under the weight of constant campaigning. England was taxed heavily to finance the struggle, its people weary of funding a king who seemed forever absent. Still, Richard pressed on. To him, the defense of his continental empire was not optional. It was his very identity. He was not merely King of England, he was Duke of Normandy, Lord of Anjou, ruler of Aquitaine. To lose those titles was to lose himself. As the years stretched on, Chateau Gaillard stood as a beacon of Richard's determination. Chroniclers described it as gleaming white against the dark cliffs, a fortress like a crown upon the brow of Normandy. To the English, it was a reassurance that their king would not yield. To the French, it was a taunt, a defiance carved in stone. For Richard, it was pride itself, his beloved child, the lasting monument of his reign. The war with Philip Augustus was not simply a continuation of old rivalries. It was the defining struggle of Richard's final years. where the crusade had set him against Saladin in battles that stirred the faith of nations. The war in France set him against Philip in contests of land, loyalty, and strategy. The two conflicts mirrored one another. One fought for Jerusalem, the other for Normandy. In both, Richard sought to prove himself not merely as a ruler, but as the greatest warrior of his age. By 1198, Richard seemed to have regained the upper hand. His campaigns had pushed Philip back, his castles stood strong, and his enemies feared his name once more. The Lionheart, scarred by crusade and captivity, had returned to his homeland with renewed vigor. From the walls of Chateau Gaillard, he looked out over the Seine Valley, confident that the realm of his ancestors was secure. The fortress gleamed in the setting sun, a monument to his iron will, a cinematic vision of stone and sky. And yet, destiny was not done with him. For all his victories, for all his brilliance, the Lionheart's story was racing toward a sudden and tragic end. By the close of 1198, Richard seemed to have bent fortune back to his will. Yet the grand contest with Philip was giving way to smaller quarrels, restive vassals, stubborn viscounts, disputed hordes, where chance and proximity could wound more surely than armies. Turning from kings and sultans to local defiance, the Lionheart stepped off the broad stage of empire onto the narrow ledge of contingency. So when the winter loosened its grip in the spring of 1199, his road ran south into Limousin and toward Chalus. By the late 1190s, Richard seemed invincible. He had survived the deserts of the Holy Land, the dungeons of Germany, and the relentless assaults of Philip Augustus. He had returned to Normandy stronger than before, building castles that gleamed like monuments to his defiance. His name was whispered with awe across Christendom and even in the courts of his enemies. He was the Lionheart, a king whose very presence seemed to defy fate itself. Yet fate, as always, had its own designs. In the spring of 1199, Richard turned his attention to a minor dispute in the Limousin, deep in Aquitaine. The quarrel was not with a great king or a mighty sultan, but with the Viscount of Limoges, over a treasure said to have been unearthed on the lands of Chalus. Gold and silver objects, perhaps the remnants of an ancient hoard, had been discovered by peasants. Richard, ever in need of funds for his endless wars, demanded the treasure as his due. When the Viscount refused, Richard marched to enforce his claim. The siege of Chalus was no great epic campaign. The fortress was small, its garrison insignificant compared to the armies Richard had faced in his life. Yet it was here, on this unassuming hilltop, that destiny would catch him. Chroniclers describe Richard inspecting the walls, directing his men with the same vigor he had shown at Acre or Arsuf. He moved close to the battlements, fearless as ever, exposing himself where caution might have advised otherwise. From the ramparts, a defender loosed a quarrel from a crossbow. The man was no knight, no seasoned soldier, but a simple peasant or artisan conscripted into service. His shot struck Richard. The wound at first seemed minor, yet infection soon set in. For days, he lingered, his once indomitable body failing him at last. In those final hours, Richard revealed not only the fierceness that had defined him, but also a rare glimpse of grace. The man who had fired the bolt was brought before him. Many expected Richard to order his execution, to exact vengeance for the indignity of being struck down not by a king, but by a commoner. Instead, Richard looked upon him, and with a surprising calm, granted pardon. "You have served your lord as best you could," he is said to have declared. With that act of mercy, the Lionheart reminded all present that chivalry was not only about conquest, but also about magnanimity. As word spread that the king was dying, Eleanor of Aquitaine, now an old woman of nearly 80, came to her son's side. She had outlived her husband, seen her sons war against one another, endured rebellion, betrayal, and captivity. Now she came to Chalus to hold the hand of the son who had been her pride and torment in equal measure. Chroniclers describe her grief as profound, yet dignified, the sorrow of a mother who had long known that warriors seldom die in their beds. Richard's death in April 1199 ended an era. He was 41 years old, in the prime of his strength, yet brought down not by Saladin or Philip Augustus, but by the hand of an obscure defender on the walls of a minor fortress. The irony struck contemporaries deeply. This was the man who had faced the greatest armies of East and West. who had endured the storms of crusade and captivity, yet fell to a quarrel fired by an unknown peasant. To many, it seemed a cruel jest of fate, the final twist in the life of a king who had always courted both glory and danger. The funeral arrangements reflected both his stature and the complexity of his legacy. His body was interred at Fontevraud Abbey beside his father Henry II, uniting in death two men who had so often clashed in life. His heart was sent to Rouen, the capital of Normandy, symbolizing his devotion to the duchy he had fought so hard to defend. His entrails were buried at Chalus, the site of his final battle, a grim reminder of the place where his destiny had been sealed. In this way, Richard's remains were scattered across the lands that had defined him: Anjou, Normandy, and Aquitaine, his very body a map of the empire he had struggled to hold together. For Eleanor, the loss was immeasurable. She had once carried him as a child through the vineyards of Aquitaine, seen him crowned in Westminster, watched him sail across the seas to Jerusalem. Now she buried him with her own hands, her life's story bound forever to his. She would live a few more years, but her heart, like the empire, was diminished. The great queen, who had marched on crusade, defied kings, and raised warrior sons, closed her days in the quiet of Fontevraud, where Richard's tomb lay beneath cold stone. The death of the Lionheart was mourned across Christendom. Songs were composed, chronicles written, all echoing the paradox of his end. He had embodied the very ideal of the knightly king, brave, magnanimous, relentless. Yet his life closed not with a blaze of glory on the sands of Palestine, but with a quiet, almost ignoble wound in the hills of Aquitaine. To his admirers, this only heightened his legend, for it showed that even the greatest of kings remained mortal, their fates subject to the smallest turns of chance. In the centuries that followed, Richard's name endured. To the English, he became the archetype of the warrior king, the hero who marched east to challenge Saladin, the monarch whose lion heart beat for glory rather than governance. To the French, he was both rival and exemplar, a reminder of the might that once checked Capetian ambition. To poets and troubadours, he was a patron of song and a knight of romance, his deeds woven into the tapestry of medieval chivalry. Yet his legacy was also one of paradox. Richard spent scarcely more than 6 months of his reign in England, a land that adored him, but scarcely knew him. He drained its coffers, demanded its sacrifices, yet left its governance largely to others. His true kingdom was always the battlefield, his true crown the laurels of victory. He embodied the glory of the Crusader ideal, yet also the futility of its endless wars. He defended Normandy with brilliance, yet his empire would crumble within a generation of his death. And perhaps it was this paradox that made him so compelling. Richard was no administrator, no builder of laws, no father of institutions. He was a man of action, of song, of legend. His life was a crusade, his reign a campaign, his death a ballad of irony and fate. He was, in every sense, the Lionheart, bold, reckless, magnificent, flawed. At Chalus, the white fortress faded into the mists of history, yet the story of what happened there lived on. The image of the king forgiving the man who had struck him down, the vision of Eleanor bending over her son's lifeless body, the scattering of his remains across 3 lands, all these became part of the myth. Richard did not die in Jerusalem, as many had once imagined he would, but in that quiet corner of Aquitaine, he achieved another kind of immortality. For the Lionheart, death was not defeat, but transformation. His body was buried, but his legend rose, carried in songs, in chronicles, and in the hearts of those who dreamed of kings who were also knights, of rulers who lived and died by the sword. The Crusader king was gone, but the memory of his courage endured, echoing across the centuries as the story of a monarch who sought glory above all and met fate with the same unflinching spirit that had carried him through life. Thus ended the tale of Richard the Lionheart, not on the walls of Jerusalem, but in the quiet hills of Aquitaine, not in the clash of armies, but in the flight of a single quarrel, not with triumph, but with mercy. His was a life that burned bright, a heart that beat fiercely, and a death that left the world to wonder what greatness truly means. And so the Lionheart was laid to rest, his body scattered across the lands he had fought to hold, his memory entrusted to the prayers of monks and the sorrow of his mother. Yet death did not close his story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. From that quiet spring in 1199, Richard passed from the realm of kings into the realm of memory, where chronicles, songs, and legends would keep his name alive long after his empire had faded. The death of Richard the Lionheart did not silence his name. If anything, it set it free. Where his body lay in divided fragments, in Fontevraud, Rouen, and Chalus, his memory multiplied, scattering into chronicles, songs, and stories that would echo across centuries. Kings are often judged by the laws they write, the taxes they levy, or the peace they leave behind. Richard wrote few laws, levied heavy burdens, and left no peace. Yet his reign endures in legend more than in parchment. To his people and to posterity, he became not simply a king, but a symbol. In the imagination of medieval England, Richard soon transcended history to enter the realm of folklore. Ballads began to speak of him not as the distant monarch who drained coffers for distant wars, but as the absent yet noble sovereign whose return would right all wrongs. Here was the seed of one of England's most enduring tales, the stories of Robin Hood. In these legends, Robin and his merry band of outlaws defied corrupt sheriffs and greedy nobles, always with the hope that one day their true king, Richard, would return from crusade to set things right. The tale inverted reality, where Richard had in truth left England largely in the hands of rapacious ministers and his scheming brother John. The stories imagined him as the hidden guardian of justice, the righteous monarch whose mere presence promised fairness. The Robin Hood tradition transformed Richard into something more than a man. He became an ideal. While John was remembered as the tyrant who exploited and oppressed, Richard was cast as the absent hero, the embodiment of the kingdom's hope. Even centuries later, when England struggled with its identity, poets and playwrights turned to the Lionheart as the king whose shadow had never entirely faded. The lion emblazoned on his shield became not just a heraldic device, but the image of English courage itself. 3 lions passant, golden on a red field, roared from banners and shields long after his bones had turned to dust. As a cultural figure, Richard was thus woven into England's national fabric. To sing of him was to sing of chivalry, of knightly honor, of courage against overwhelming odds. His epithet, Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, captured the imagination. Other kings had names tied to lands or titles. Richard's was tied to the essence of bravery itself. In him, England found not a legislator or administrator, but a hero king, the kind of ruler that ballads and romances exalt. And yet the historians, even in Richard's own age, were less forgiving. The chroniclers of his reign left a divided picture. Some praised his valor, his skill in battle, his magnanimity even in death. Others condemned him as a king who abandoned his realm for dreams of crusade, who taxed his subjects into hardship, who treated England as nothing more than a treasury for his foreign wars. He is said to have declared that he would sell London itself if a buyer could be found. Whether or not the words were truly his, they captured the sense of his rule. England was the purse. France and the Holy Land were the stage. From this perspective, Richard was no model of kingship. He left behind no reforms of law or governance. He built no enduring institutions. His brother John would inherit a kingdom impoverished and restless, its people weary of the cost of his ambition. In this reading, Richard was a brilliant knight but a negligent king. A man who shone on the battlefield but dimmed in the council chamber, a sovereign who embodied the grandeur of chivalry but neglected the patient work of ruling. Yet even the harshest judgments could not deny his charisma, for in Richard Europe saw the ideal of the crusading monarch. At Arsuf, at Acre, in his duels of strategy with Saladin, he embodied the spirit of Christendom at its most fervent. His courage was not abstract. It was lived daily in the field, where he commanded not from a distant palace, but from the very front of the charge. His generosity was as famed as his wrath. His courtesy to Saladin's envoys was remembered as keenly as his storming of castles. He was at once reckless and magnificent, flawed and exalted. The comparison to Saladin became inevitable. Across the divide of faith, these two men became mirror images. Richard, the knightly king of the West, Saladin, the just sultan of the East. Each was praised even by his enemies. Muslim chroniclers admired Richard's courage, his frankness, his refusal to betray a word once given. Christian chroniclers marveled at Saladin's mercy, his dignity, his refusal to slaughter indiscriminately. They never met in single combat, yet their rivalry became the stuff of legend, told as if it had been a duel of champions. In their mutual respect, Europe and the Near East glimpsed something rare, the possibility that honor could cross the boundaries of religion. The memory of Richard and Saladin together outlasted the crusade itself. Long after Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, long after the banner of the cross had faded from its walls, people still told of the Lionheart and the Sultan, of how two men could wage war with ferocity, yet honor each other with respect. In this way, both became archetypes. Richard represented the restless courage of the West, Saladin, the steadfast justice of the East. Their rivalry was not only a clash of arms, but a meeting of legends, two figures destined to stand forever as equals in history's memory. As centuries passed, Richard's legacy shifted with England's needs. In times of national pride, he was recalled as the heroic king, whose heart roared for battle. In times of political reform, he was criticized as the absent monarch who failed to govern. Shakespeare's history plays only brushed against his figure, but later writers and artists resurrected him as a symbol of medieval glory. In the Victorian age, when empire and chivalry were once again celebrated, statues of Richard were raised, most famously outside the Palace of Westminster, where he sits astride his horse, sword raised, eternally charging into memory. Thus the Lionheart lives on, not in statutes of law, nor in charters signed, but in imagination. He is the king of song and story, the monarch of romance and ballad. His reign was brief, his accomplishments fleeting, but his legend was eternal. He reminds us that history is not only written in parchment, but also sung in verse, painted in color, and carved in stone. To weigh Richard is to weigh paradox. He was a king who gave little thought to his kingdom, yet inspired fierce loyalty. He was a monarch who drained his treasury, yet left behind the image of wealth in courage. He failed to capture Jerusalem, yet his name is forever tied to the crusade. He built few palaces, but raised a fortress that still stands in ruins as a symbol of his will. He was both the worst of kings and the greatest of knights, a ruler who embodied the contradictions of his age. In the end, Richard the Lionheart became larger than the sum of his deeds. His life was not defined by governance but by legend. He lived as though he were a character in the very romances that troubadours sang in his Aquitaine youth, and in death he became precisely that, a figure half historical, half mythic, who continues to haunt the imagination of nations. His lions still roar on England's arms. His shadow still rides through the greenwood in the tales of Robin Hood. His name still conjures visions of crusade and chivalry. So it is that Richard Plantagenet, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Lord of Anjou, and son of Eleanor of Aquitaine, is remembered not for the laws he passed or the peace he kept, but for the heart he carried. A lion's heart, fierce and unyielding, that beat for glory more than governance, for adventure more than administration. He was no model of the prudent king, but he was the very embodiment of the knightly dream, and in that he achieved what few monarchs ever could, to become for all time a legend. Thus, the story of Richard's legacy, both as a burdened ruler and a celebrated hero, found its place in memory. Songs, chronicles, and statues carried his name far beyond the years of his reign, shaping how later generations would see him, not through the policies he left behind, but through the ideals he seemed to embody. Yet memory, however grand, always leads back to the silence of stone. To understand Richard fully, one must return to the place where his journey ended, among the shadows and prayers of Fontevraud Abbey. The candles burned low in the quiet of Fontevraud Abbey. Their glow trembled across the stone floor, lighting the carved effigy of Richard I, King of England. The figure lay in still repose, sword upon his chest, eyes closed in eternal rest. Here was the man who had carried the weight of empires, who had led armies across seas and deserts, who had stood against Saladin and Philip Augustus, now reduced to silence beneath a roof of arches and prayers. His tomb told two stories. One was of Richard the Ruler, a king whose reign spanned only a decade, much of it spent far from his kingdom. He burdened his people with heavy taxes, drained their wealth to fund campaigns in distant lands, and left the daily governance of England to others. To those who suffered the cost of his ambition, he could seem a distant, neglectful sovereign, more crusader than king. The other story was of Richard the Legend, the Lionheart, whose courage on the battlefield was unmatched, who inspired awe in both allies and foes. He became the hero of songs and ballads, remembered not for laws or charters, but for the daring of his campaigns, his willingness to ride at the front of the charge, and the aura of knighthood he carried. In folklore, he emerged as the absent but noble king, the figure whose eventual return promised justice. His shield, marked with lions, endured as a national symbol long after his bones had been laid to rest. Between these two stories lies the truth, as complex as the man himself. Richard was both hero and burden, both inspiration and challenge. He embodied the ideals of his age, the restless search for glory, the devotion to faith, the fierce loyalty to family lands on the continent. Yet his reign also revealed the limits of such ideals. Kingship demanded order, justice, and presence, all of which Richard too often neglected. He loved the field of battle more than the chamber of council, the clash of swords more than the patience of governance. And yet, people remembered him with a kind of reverence that outlasted the criticisms of his reign. His death, struck by a common soldier at Chalus, seemed almost a parable, that greatness may fall to chance, that even the mightiest of rulers remain mortal. But his act of forgiveness toward the man who shot him gave to his memory a final gesture of nobility. It allowed the Lionheart to be remembered not only as a warrior, but as a king capable of mercy. In the years that followed, his story became inseparable from that of England itself. Ballads of Robin Hood placed him at their heart, casting him as the rightful king who contrasted with his brother John. To later generations, Richard came to symbolize courage and honor, a reminder of a time when kings were also knights. Statues were raised in his likeness, poets sang of his deeds, and historians debated his faults and virtues. The Lionheart remained alive, not in body, but in legend. At Fontevraud, his effigy still lies among the Plantagenet dead. His heart rests in Rouen, his entrails in Chalus, his body in Anjou, a life scattered across the lands he fought to keep. His mother, Eleanor, who had fought so fiercely for him in life, saw him laid to rest, and with him a part of her own story ended. Across the Channel, Philip Augustus recognized that the balance of power had changed forever. In the East, Saladin's name remained bound to Richard's, two rivals remembered together, respected even by their foes. Richard's life shows us the tension between legend and truth. The legend tells of the fearless Crusader, the knightly king, the Lionheart, whose courage never failed. The truth speaks of a monarch who left his kingdom strained, who demanded sacrifice without always offering protection, who lived more for glory than for governance. Both stories are real, and both endure. As the abbey falls into silence, the Stone King lies motionless, but his name continues to resound. Richard the Lionheart was not merely a ruler of England, but a symbol of what men hoped kings could be: brave, magnanimous, larger than life. His reign may have been brief, his achievements mixed, but his memory became eternal. He reminds us that greatness is not always measured by governance or peace, but sometimes by the power of a story that will not fade. The candles die down, shadows close in, and prayers continue in hushed tones. Yet beyond the quiet abbey, Richard rides still, in chronicles, in ballads, in the imagination of nations. He is remembered as both man and myth, both sovereign and symbol. And though the Lionheart lies still, the echo of his name continues to roar across the centuries.